3 years after the Hollow Creek fire, people believed the triplets were gone. They were wrong. On a cold autumn evening in 1851, a hunter named Elias Boone entered the Mississippi woods near the ruins of Hollow Creek Plantation. He had come searching for a wounded deer that had disappeared into the trees before sunset. The locals warned him not to hunt there. Most people avoided the old plantation entirely. They said strange things still lingered among the ruins. Strange sounds, strange shadows, strange memories. Elias ignored the stories. He believed in tracks, footprints, and facts. Not ghosts, not curses, and certainly not the old stories about 3 enslaved sisters who vanished during the fire that destroyed Hollow Creek years earlier. As darkness settled over the forest, he followed a trail of broken branches deeper into the woods. Then he heard it, a sound, soft, distant, almost impossible to notice at first. Elias stopped walking. The forest fell silent. No birds, no insects, no wind. Then the sound returned. 3 voices, humming together. His blood turned cold. Every child in Mississippi had heard the story. The Hollow Creek Triplets. 3 girls locked beneath a plantation house. 3 girls who sang in the dark. 3 girls who vanished without a trace on the night the plantation burned. According to the stories, their humming had disappeared forever. Yet the sound drifting through the woods was exactly the same. Low, steady, unbroken. The humming seemed to move between the trees, pulling him forward. Against his better judgment, Elias followed it. Step by step, the deeper he walked, the louder it became, until he reached a hidden clearing surrounded by ancient oak trees. And then the humming stopped. Instantly, the sudden silence felt worse than the sound itself. Elias scanned the clearing. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then something caught his eye, a patch of disturbed earth beneath the roots of a massive oak. Kneeling down, he brushed away dirt and dead leaves. Metal, rust-covered metal. His pulse quickened. He grabbed a fallen branch and began digging. Minutes later, he uncovered a small iron box buried deep beneath the roots. It looked ancient, hidden deliberately, forgotten by everyone, or perhaps waiting to be found. The lock had long since rotted away. With shaking hands, Elias lifted the lid. Inside lay a bundle of papers wrapped in decayed cloth. Most had been destroyed by moisture and time. But one item remained intact, a leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked and blackened around the edges as though it had survived a fire. Faded initials were barely visible on the front. Dr.W. Elias opened it. The first pages contained medical observations, measurements, sketches, dates. The handwriting was neat, precise, professional. But as he turned the pages, everything changed. The writing became frantic, uneven, terrified, as though the author had been recording something he no longer understood. Then Elias reached the final surviving page. One sentence filled the bottom half of the paper, underlined twice, written with such force that the ink nearly tore through the page. And as the last light faded from the Mississippi woods, Elias read the words that would reopen the darkest mystery Hollow Creek had ever buried. They were never meant to survive. Elias Boone did not sleep that night. The words he had read in the journal followed him long after he left the woods. They were never meant to survive. The sentence echoed in his mind with every mile he traveled away from Hollow Creek. By sunrise, he had made a decision. There was only one man in the county who might understand what he had found: Reverend Samuel Carter. The elderly preacher had spent decades collecting forgotten stories from former slaves and their descendants. While most people dismissed old plantation legends as superstition, Samuel believed that buried stories often contained fragments of truth. The next morning, Elias carried the journal to the small church standing at the edge of town. When the preacher first saw the blackened leather cover, his expression changed immediately. His hands froze, his eyes narrowed, and for several seconds he said nothing. "You found this near Hollow Creek, didn't you?" he finally asked. Elias felt a chill. He had not mentioned where the journal came from. The preacher slowly nodded. "There are stories about a missing physician," he whispered. "Stories that should have died with the plantation." Together they opened the journal beneath the light of a single oil lamp. The first pages contained medical observations, dates, measurements, descriptions of behavior. At the bottom of several pages appeared the same signature: Dr. Daniel R. Whitmore, a physician who had reportedly visited Hollow Creek Plantation shortly before the triplets disappeared. Most historians believed his records had been destroyed in the plantation fire. Yet somehow one journal had survived. As they turned the pages, something strange became obvious. Large sections were missing. Entire pages had been ripped out. Others appeared burned away. Several entries ended abruptly in the middle of sentences. It looked less like accidental damage and more like deliberate removal, as though someone had wanted certain information erased. The deeper they read, the more unsettling the journal became. The early entries described the triplets as ordinary children, healthy, quiet, remarkably intelligent. But over time, Dr. Whitmore's observations changed. His language became cautious, then fearful, then almost desperate. One entry read, "All three children exhibit unusual synchronization. Their movements remain nearly identical, even when separated." Another stated, "They appear aware of events occurring beyond their immediate surroundings." A later entry was underlined repeatedly, "Their behavior cannot be explained through conventional observation." Samuel looked up from the page. Neither man spoke. The room suddenly felt colder. But the most disturbing entries concerned the humming. According to Dr. Whitmore, the sound affected people differently depending on how long they were exposed to it. At first, listeners reported unease, then sleeplessness, then recurring dreams. But what truly frightened him was what happened next. The effects did not stop when people left the plantation. Several physicians reported hearing the humming days after departing Hollow Creek. One man claimed he heard it nearly 50 miles away while staying at a boarding house. Another wrote that the sound appeared in his dreams every night for weeks. Dr. Whitmore called this phenomenon impossible. Yet his own journal suggested he was experiencing it himself. As the entries progressed, references to the humming appeared more frequently, almost obsessively. The physician described waking in the middle of the night, convinced someone was standing beside his bed. He reported hearing faint voices in empty rooms. He claimed the humming sometimes continued even when the triplets were asleep. One passage had been written so heavily that the ink had bled through multiple pages. "The sound is no longer coming from the children." Neither Elias nor Samuel knew what that meant, but both felt uneasy reading it. Then they discovered something even stranger. Near the back of the journal, several pages had been torn out completely. Only jagged fragments remained. Yet one surviving corner contained a warning written in hurried handwriting. The words were barely legible. "Do not separate them." Another fragment read, "We were wrong about what they are." And beneath it, "If this journal is found." The rest of the sentence was missing. Samuel carefully closed the book. The church was silent. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the windows. For several moments neither man moved. Then the preacher spoke. His voice was little more than a whisper. "If these pages are real, then the fire didn't destroy the truth." Elias stared at the weathered journal resting between them. The physician's notes raised more questions than answers. Who removed the missing pages? What had Dr. Whitmore discovered? And why had someone gone to such lengths to hide it? But one thing was becoming painfully clear. The mystery of the Hollow Creek triplets had not ended with the fire. It had only been buried. And now, after 3 years of silence, someone or something was leading them back to it. The journal raised more questions than it answered. For 3 days, Reverend Samuel Carter and Elias Boone studied its surviving pages inside the small church at the edge of town. Every sentence seemed to hint at something larger hidden beneath the surface. The physician's observations grew stranger with each entry, yet the missing pages prevented them from seeing the full picture. They needed more than ink. They needed witnesses. Samuel knew exactly who might still remember. Many of the people who had survived the final years of Hollow Creek Plantation were now elderly. Some lived in nearby farming communities. Others had settled in small towns along the Mississippi River after emancipation. Most rarely spoke about the plantation, not because they had forgotten, because they remembered too well. Samuel reached out to an old friend, a local schoolteacher named Abigail Turner. Unlike most historians, Abigail spent years collecting oral histories from former slaves and their families. She believed memories carried truths that official records often buried. When Samuel showed her the journal, she immediately agreed to help. "If the answers still exist," she said, carefully turning one of the fragile pages, "they won't be in government records. They'll be in people's memories." Within a week, the three began traveling across the county. Their first stop was a small cabin occupied by an elderly woman named Ruth Walker. Ruth had been a child at Hollow Creek during the final years before the fire. Her eyesight was fading. Her hands trembled with age. Yet when Samuel mentioned the triplets, her expression changed instantly. "I remember them," she whispered. The room fell silent. "What happened to them?" Abigail asked. Ruth stared into the fireplace. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she slowly shook her head. "No one knows. But I know this. They were alive after the fire." Elias felt his heart pound. That detail matched nothing in the official records. Ruth explained that several days after the plantation burned, whispers spread through the former slave quarters. People claimed they had seen three girls walking near the river at dawn, hand in hand, silent, unharmed. The story terrified the masters, but comforted many of the enslaved. Before they could ask more questions, Ruth simply repeated the same sentence. "They survived the fire." That evening, the investigators visited another witness, an elderly man named Isaiah Reed. Isaiah had worked near the plantation stables as a teenager. His account differed greatly from Ruth's. According to him, the girls were seen deep inside the woods several weeks after the fire. A group of former workers claimed they heard humming near an abandoned hunting trail. When they followed the sound, they spotted three figures standing among the trees. The moment they approached, the figures disappeared. "They weren't ghosts," Isaiah insisted. "They were real. I know what I saw." Yet when asked what happened next, he could provide no answers. The girls simply vanished again. Days later, Samuel and Abigail interviewed a third witness, an elderly former house servant named Martha Green. Her story contradicted both previous accounts. Martha claimed the triplets never entered the woods at all. Instead, she believed they escaped north with the help of plantation servants. According to rumors she heard after the fire, several sympathetic workers had hidden the girls and smuggled them away before the chaos ended. She swore the triplets survived, but admitted she had never seen them herself. As the days passed, more stories emerged. Some claimed the sisters crossed the river. Others believed they disappeared into nearby swamps. A few insisted they were never human to begin with. Every witness remembered something different. Every story contained contradictions. Every detail seemed impossible to verify. Yet one fact appeared again and again. No matter who they interviewed, no matter how different the account, one detail never changed. The girls were seen after the fire. Again and again, witnesses repeated the same claim. Some saw them near the river. Some saw them in the woods. Others heard their voices long after Hollow Creek burned. But none believed the triplets died that night. Late one evening, Samuel sat reviewing his notes while Abigail organized witness statements across a wooden table. The pattern was impossible to ignore. "The stories are different," Elias said. "But the ending is always the same." Abigail nodded slowly. The fire wasn't the end. Samuel stared at the physician's journal lying beside the witness reports. Then he noticed something. A date. One of the final surviving journal entries had been written only days before the fire. Beside it was a location scribbled hurriedly into the margin. Most of the writing had faded, but 3 words remained visible. Blackwater River Crossing. The room grew silent. None of them had heard that location mentioned before, yet every witness seemed to point toward the river. For the first time since finding the journal, they had something tangible. A real place, possible trail, and somewhere beyond that river, they suspected the next piece of the Hollow Creek mystery was waiting to be found. The name Blackwater River Crossing appeared only once in Dr. Whitmore's journal. 3 faded words scribbled into the margin of a damaged page. Yet the more Samuel, Abigail, and Elias studied their witness statements, the more that location seemed to surface indirectly. The river. Always the river. Nearly every account eventually led there. A week later, their search brought them to a remote settlement several miles south of Hollow Creek. According to local records, an elderly man named Benjamin Carter lived there alone. Benjamin was nearly 80 years old. More importantly, he had been a child at Hollow Creek when the fire occurred. Unlike most former workers, he rarely spoke about those years. In fact, many believed he knew far more than he ever admitted. When Samuel arrived at the small cabin and explained their investigation, Benjamin's expression immediately darkened. For several moments he stared at the physician's journal resting on the table. Then his eyes settled on the words Blackwater River Crossing. The old man's hands began to tremble. "You found that name," he whispered. No one answered. Benjamin slowly lowered himself into a chair. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, the room felt painfully still. After nearly 70 years of silence, the old man finally began to speak. "I never told anyone." His voice was barely audible. "Not my wife. Not my children. Not even the preacher." Samuel exchanged a glance with Abigail. They knew immediately this was different. This was not another rumor. This was a confession. Benjamin stared into the darkness beyond the window. Then he returned to a night he had spent most of his life trying to forget. The night Hollow Creek burned. At the time, Benjamin was only 11 years old. When the fire began, chaos spread throughout the plantation. People were running, shouting, praying. The sky glowed orange as flames climbed through the plantation house. Everyone's attention was fixed on the fire. Everyone except Benjamin. He had wandered toward the river after hearing something strange. A sound. The humming. The same humming people had whispered about for years. Only this time it wasn't coming from beneath the plantation. It was coming from the woods. Benjamin followed the sound through smoke and darkness until he reached Blackwater River. What he saw there haunted him for the rest of his life. 3 figures stood near the riverbank. 3 girls, hand in hand. The Hollow Creek Triplets. "They were alive," Benjamin whispered. "I know they were." According to his account, the girls looked exactly as they always had. Calm, silent, unafraid. Behind them, the plantation burned. Yet none of them turned to look. They simply stood facing the river, listening, as if waiting for something. Benjamin remained hidden behind a fallen tree, terrified they might see him. Then something happened he never managed to explain. The girls stepped forward, straight into the water. The current was strong that night. Heavy rains earlier in the week had swollen the river. An adult would have struggled to cross. Yet the triplets walked into it without hesitation. Benjamin expected them to disappear beneath the surface. They never did. "They should have drowned," he said. "They should have been swept away." But they weren't. The room remained silent. Even Abigail had stopped writing. Benjamin's voice grew weaker. They just kept walking. According to his memory, the water rose around them. First to their ankles, then their knees, then their waists. Yet something felt wrong. The river moved around them instead of against them, almost as if the current refused to touch them. And strangest of all, their clothing never became wet. Benjamin remembered staring at their dresses illuminated by firelight from the distant plantation. The fabric remained completely dry. Not soaked. Not dripping. Dry. As impossible as that sounded. Then came the humming. Benjamin closed his eyes. Even after all those years, he could still hear it. The sound rose from the river itself. Not from the girls. Not from the woods. From the water. 3 voices blending together into a single haunting harmony. The deeper the girls moved into the river, the louder the sound became. Soon it echoed across the entire crossing. Benjamin said the vibration was so powerful he felt it in his chest, in his bones, in the ground beneath him. And then, without warning, the humming stopped. The old man opened his eyes. Tears had formed there. When the sound ended, his voice cracked. So did they. Elias leaned forward. What do you mean? Benjamin swallowed hard. I mean they were gone.
No esplas. No struggle.
No cry for help. One moment the girls stood in the river. The next moment they simply weren't there. The water flowed normally again. The humming vanished. And only darkness remained. For nearly 70 years Benjamin told no one what he had witnessed. He feared people would think he was mad. Perhaps he thought the memory would fade. It never did. Before Samuel could ask another question, Benjamin slowly pointed toward the physician's journal. Then he spoke words that chilled everyone in the room. The girls didn't run from Hollow Creek. His voice was barely above a whisper. They were going somewhere, and for the first time since the investigation began, Samuel realized they might not be searching for an escape. They might be searching for a destination. Benjamin Carter's testimony changed everything. Until that point, Samuel, Abigail, and Elias had been chasing rumors, whispers, fragments of memory. But now they had something more dangerous. A witness. Someone who claimed to have seen the Hollow Creek Triplets after the fire. And if Benjamin was telling the truth, then the physician's journal contained only part of the story. The missing pages suddenly became more important than ever. For the next several days, the 3 investigators carefully examined the journal again. Every page, every margin, every faded note. They searched for anything that might explain what Dr. Whitmore had been hiding. Then Abigail noticed something unusual. Several pages near the center of the journal were thicker than the others. At first glance they appeared blank. But when she held them beneath a lantern, faint markings became visible beneath the paper. Hidden writing. Someone had glued 2 pages together. Very carefully, very deliberately. For nearly an hour they worked to separate the fragile sheets without destroying them. When the final layer peeled apart, they discovered several concealed entries. The missing pages. And what they revealed was far worse than anyone expected. The first hidden entry was dated 6 months before the fire. Unlike the physician's earlier notes, these pages were marked confidential. They were never intended to be seen by outsiders. Dr. Whitmore described private meetings between himself, other physicians, and the owner of Hollow Creek Plantation. The master believed the triplets possessed an unusual connection. A bond beyond ordinary sibling attachment. At first the doctors dismissed the idea. Then the experiments began. According to the journal, the physicians became obsessed with understanding how the girls seemed to think, move, and react together. One doctor claimed the sisters often responded to events before they occurred. Another noted that they frequently turned their heads at the exact same moment, even when unable to see one another. The observations grew stranger with each entry. Eventually the doctors proposed a series of tests. The first was simple. Separation. The sisters were placed in different sections of the cellar. Heavy barriers were erected between them. No visual contact. No physical contact. No communication. The doctors expected distress. Instead, something far stranger happened. The humming began immediately. Each girl remained isolated. Yet all 3 produced the exact same tone. At the exact same moment. For hours. Dr. Whitmore admitted he could find no explanation. the entries became increasingly disturbed. One physician wrote, "They behave as though separation has not occurred." Another recorded, "Distance appears meaningless." The doctors expanded the experiments. The girls were moved farther apart. Different rooms, different buildings. At one point, nearly half a mile separated them. Yet, according to the journal, the humming remained synchronized. Perfectly synchronized.
No dilas, no interruptions, no errors.
As if distance itself had ceased to matter. The physicians became obsessed. What began as curiosity turned into something darker. Something desperate. The master demanded answers. The doctors promised results. And so the experiments intensified. The next phase involved sleep deprivation. The triplets were prevented from sleeping for extended periods. Observers remained with them day and night. Detailed records were kept. The doctors hoped exhaustion would weaken whatever connection existed between them. Instead, the opposite seemed to occur. The longer the girls remained awake, the stranger their behavior became. One entry described all three sisters speaking the same sentence simultaneously despite being housed in separate locations. Another reported identical dreams recorded from each girl after brief periods of rest. Even more disturbing were the psychological observations. Several physicians began documenting unusual side effects among the staff. Guards reported hearing voices. Servants complained of recurring nightmares. One overseer claimed he could hear humming long after leaving the plantation grounds. At first, the doctors blamed stress. Then the symptoms spread. The journal described episodes of paranoia, sleepwalking, auditory hallucinations, sudden emotional breakdowns. Several workers refused to enter the cellar. Others resigned entirely. Yet the most alarming case involved one of the physicians himself. A doctor named Henry Caldwell. At first, Caldwell had been the most skeptical member of the group. He openly mocked stories about curses and spirits. He believed every mystery could be explained through science. For months, he led the experiments. Then something changed. His journal entries became erratic. His handwriting deteriorated. Simple observations transformed into frantic warnings. One surviving note read, "They are listening even when absent." Another stated, "The connection extends beyond the subjects." Then came the final entry, written only weeks before the fire. The words were nearly unreadable. The ink smeared across the page as though written by shaking hands. "I hear them constantly. The humming continues at night. It follows me home. They know when we are watching." The final line was underlined repeatedly, so heavily that the paper nearly tore. "We should never have separated them." After that entry, Henry Caldwell disappeared from the journal entirely. No further observations.
No explanation.
No official record of where he went. According to plantation accounts, he simply left Hollow Creek and never returned. But Dr. Whitmore's final hidden note suggested something far more troubling. At the bottom of the last recovered page, beneath several crossed-out sentences, a single warning remained. One sentence apparently too important to erase. Samuel read it aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. The experiments did not create the connection. They revealed it. Silence filled the room. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. Abigail slowly closed the journal. Elias stared at the hidden pages spread across the table. For months they had assumed the doctors were studying a mystery. Now a far darker possibility emerged. The physicians had not been observing something unusual. They had been disturbing something they never understood. And judging by the fate of Henry Caldwell, at least one of them paid the price. For nearly 3 years after the fire at Hollow Creek, the humming had existed only in stories, in memories, in fading witness accounts whispered between generations. Most people believed it was gone. Whatever had happened to the triplets that night had vanished with them. At least that was what everyone wanted to believe. Then the reports began. The first came from a farmer living several miles north of the abandoned plantation. He arrived at Reverend Samuel Carter's church just before sunset, visibly shaken. The man claimed he had heard strange sounds coming from the woods near his property. Not voices, not animals. A humming. Low, steady, almost musical. Samuel immediately took notice. The description matched dozens of accounts connected to Hollow Creek. Still, one witness could be mistaken. Then a second report arrived. And a third. Within 2 weeks, more than a dozen people described hearing the exact same sound. Some heard it at night, others shortly before dawn. None could explain where it came from, yet every account sounded eerily familiar. 3 voices, always 3, always perfectly synchronized. Abigail began documenting each report. As the list grew longer, a disturbing pattern emerged. Most sightings occurred along a narrow stretch of forest between Hollow Creek Plantation and Blackwater River crossing. The same area mentioned by Benjamin Carter. The same area connected to the physician's journal. The same area where the triplets had supposedly been seen after the fire. Something was happening, and people were beginning to notice. Then came the sightings. A young hunter claimed he saw 3 figures standing among the trees shortly after sunset. At first he assumed they were children, but something felt wrong. The figures never moved, never spoke, never acknowledged his presence. When he approached, they vanished. Not ran, not hid, vanished. Another witness reported seeing 3 girls near the riverbank during a thunderstorm. According to her account, the children stood motionless in the rain, yet their clothing appeared completely dry. The story spread quickly. Soon dozens of versions circulated through nearby towns. Some dismissed them as imagination. Others were not so certain. The old fear that once surrounded Hollow Creek slowly began returning. Then the new owner of the plantation entered the story. Several years after the fire, the abandoned property had been purchased by a businessman named Charles Whitaker. Unlike the locals, Whitaker had no interest in ghost stories. He considered Hollow Creek a valuable piece of land. Nothing more. When neighbors warned him about the history of the plantation, he laughed. When workers refused to stay after dark, he hired new workers. When people spoke of humming in the woods, he called it superstition. For a while, his confidence remained unshaken. Then he moved into the partially restored plantation house. And everything changed. According to letters later shared with Samuel, Whitaker began experiencing strange disturbances almost immediately. At first it was minor. Footsteps in empty hallways, doors opening during the night, faint sounds beneath the floorboards. He blamed the old structure. Then the humming began. Every night at exactly the same hour, just after midnight. 3 voices, low, steady, unbroken. Whitaker searched the property repeatedly. He found nothing.
No trespassers.
No animals.
No explanation.
Yet the sound continued. Night after night. The letters became increasingly frantic. One described waking to find muddy footprints inside his bedroom. Another claimed he heard humming directly outside his window despite seeing no one there. The final letter was the most disturbing. Whitaker wrote that he looked from an upstairs window during a storm and saw 3 figures standing near the edge of the woods, watching the house, waiting. The next morning, he rode into town and announced his intention to sell the property. Immediately,
No negotiations.
no conditions, just sell. Within a month, he was gone. No one ever saw him return to Hollow Creek again. His departure reignited fears that had slept for years. People who once laughed at the old stories grew quiet. Parents warned children not to wander near the plantation. Travelers avoided the area after dark. And former witnesses who had remained silent suddenly began sharing experiences of their own. The stories differed, but the feeling remained the same. Something had returned. One evening, as Samuel and Abigail reviewed the newest reports, Elias noticed something disturbing. The sightings were becoming more frequent, not less. The humming was spreading. And for the first time since finding the journal, Samuel felt genuine fear. Because if the witnesses were telling the truth, then whatever the physicians had disturbed decades earlier had not disappeared. It had simply been waiting. And now, after years of silence, it was calling people back to Hollow Creek once again. The reports were becoming impossible to ignore. Every witness pointed toward the same stretch of wilderness between Hollow Creek Plantation and Blackwater River crossing. The sightings, the humming, the strange figures seen among the trees. Everything seemed connected to that narrow section of forest. Eventually Samuel decided they could wait no longer. If answers still existed, they were not hidden inside journals. They were hidden in the woods. 3 days later, Samuel, Abigail, and Elias set out before sunrise. The forest felt different the moment they entered it. Older, quieter. The deeper they traveled, the less wildlife they encountered.
No birds. No deer.
Not even insects, only silence. A heavy silence that seemed to press against their ears. By afternoon they reached the area described by multiple witnesses. The same region where Benjamin Carter claimed to have seen the triplets crossing the river. The same region where hunters reported hearing the humming. For several hours they found nothing. Then Elias noticed something unusual. A narrow path hidden beneath thick vegetation. At first glance it appeared natural. But the ground beneath it was worn smooth. Someone had used this trail repeatedly. Many years ago, the path led deeper into the forest. Eventually the trees opened into a small clearing. And there, partially hidden beneath vines and moss, stood an abandoned cabin. No witness had ever mentioned it. The structure was old, far older than expected. Its roof had partially collapsed. The windows were shattered. The walls leaned dangerously to one side. Yet somehow it remained standing. Waiting, the investigators approached cautiously. As Samuel pushed open the rotting door, a wave of stale air escaped from inside. Dust covered everything. But something immediately felt wrong. This was not a hunter's cabin, nor a simple shelter. Someone had lived here. For a long time. Abigail stepped inside first, then stopped. "What is that?" she whispered. Samuel followed her gaze. Symbols. Dozens of them. Strange markings had been carved into the wooden walls. Others were painted near the windows. Some appeared geometric. Others resembled circles connected by 3 parallel lines. The same pattern repeated again and again throughout the cabin. None of them recognized the symbols, yet they all felt strangely familiar, as if they had seen them somewhere before. Then Elias remembered. The physician's journal. Several hidden pages contained rough sketches resembling the same designs. His stomach tightened. The connection was impossible to ignore. Someone associated with the triplets had been here. The question was who? The answer seemed to appear moments later. Near the rear wall sat a collection of burned belongings.
A rusta cooking pot.
Fragments of old fabric. Charred books. Broken lantern parts. Most had been damaged by fire years earlier. Yet, unlike the plantation fire, these objects appeared intentionally burned. As though someone had tried to destroy evidence. Abigail carefully searched through the remains. Among the ashes she discovered something that made everyone freeze. A small wooden doll, hand-carved, worn with age. Then another, and another. 3 dolls. Nearly identical. No one spoke. The cabin suddenly felt colder. As they continued searching, Elias uncovered the most disturbing discovery yet. A hidden room, partially concealed behind a collapsed section of wall. Inside stood 3 small wooden beds. Not adult beds, children's beds. All positioned side by side. Dust covered the blankets, yet their arrangement remained untouched, as if the occupants had simply left and never returned. Samuel examined the room carefully. Near one bed he discovered faded markings scratched into the wood. 3 vertical lines, repeated dozens of times. Near another bed, Abigail found something even more significant. A scrap of cloth. preserved beneath a loose floorboard. Though badly aged, the material matched descriptions of the dresses witnesses claimed the triplets wore on the night of the fire. The room fell silent. The evidence was becoming impossible to dismiss. If authentic, it meant one thing. The triplets survived. At least for a while. They had reached the woods. They had lived here, perhaps for weeks, perhaps longer. Every official account claimed the girls vanished during the fire. Yet this cabin suggested otherwise. The sisters had escaped Hollow Creek, and someone had hidden them, or they had hidden themselves. As the afternoon sun began disappearing behind the trees, Samuel made one final discovery. Carved into the wall above the center bed were 4 words, barely visible beneath decades of dust. Words that sent a chill through everyone present. They are still together.
No signature. No explanation.
Only those 4 words. Outside, the forest remained silent. But as the investigators prepared to leave, Abigail suddenly stopped walking. For a brief moment, she thought she heard something drifting through the trees. A sound. Soft. Distant. Almost impossible to hear. 3 voices. Humming. The discovery of the cabin changed the investigation. For the first time, Samuel, Abigail, and Elias possessed physical evidence that the Hollow Creek triplets had survived the fire. The 3 beds. The dolls. The cloth hidden beneath the floorboards. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. The girls had reached the woods. But one question still remained. Why? What had truly happened at Hollow Creek? The answer arrived unexpectedly. 2 days after returning from the cabin, Abigail resumed examining the physician's journal. She had become convinced that one final secret remained hidden inside its pages. The missing pieces. The pages everyone had searched for. The pages someone had desperately tried to erase. Late that evening, while studying the journal beneath lamplight, she noticed something unusual near the back cover. A raised section hidden beneath the leather binding. Carefully, she separated the damaged material. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, the final missing page. For several moments, nobody spoke. Samuel unfolded the fragile document with trembling hands. The handwriting belonged to Dr. Daniel Whitmore. Unlike previous entries, this page contained no measurements.
No observations.
No experiments. Only a confession. A confession apparently written shortly before the plantation burned. The physician's handwriting shook across the page. Fear bled through every line, as though he had finally realized something terrible. The entry began, "For months we believed we were studying the children. We were wrong." The room fell silent. Samuel continued reading. Whitmore described the obsession that had consumed the plantation owner and the physicians who worked for him. Their desire to control, to understand, to possess. They convinced themselves that the triplets were dangerous because they could not explain them. Every unusual event, every strange occurrence, every fear. The doctors blamed the girls. But according to Whitmore, the truth was something entirely different. The experiments themselves had become the danger, the cruelty, the isolation, the endless attempts to dominate something they did not understand. Each effort to control the sisters only made the situation worse. The physician admitted that none of them ever considered the simplest possibility, that the girls were merely children, children trapped inside a nightmare created by adults. Then came the final paragraph. The words appeared darker than the rest of the entry, written with such force that the ink nearly tore through the paper. Samuel read them aloud. The girls were never the danger. The masters were. No one spoke. Outside, thunder rolled across the distant horizon. For a long moment, the only sound inside the church was the crackling of the oil lamp. The confession continued. Whitmore revealed that shortly before the fire, several plantation workers secretly approached him. They believed the triplets would eventually be killed if they remained at Hollow Creek. The physicians had become obsessed. The master had become paranoid. Fear was consuming everyone involved. According to Whitmore, a plan was created. A desperate plan. The girls would be removed from the plantation, hidden, protected, taken somewhere beyond the reach of Hollow Creek. Whitmore never revealed exactly who carried out the escape. Perhaps he feared someone would find the journal. Perhaps he wished to protect those involved. But one sentence stood out above all others. They crossed the river before the fire began. Elias felt his heart race. Benjamin Carter's story had been true. The witnesses had been telling the truth all along. The triplets survived, at least for a time. Yet the final lines of the confession introduced a new mystery. One even Whitmore could not explain. After crossing Blackwater River, the girls disappeared. Not from Hollow Creek. From everyone. The people assigned to protect them eventually lost track of them. No bodies were found. No graves discovered. No records created. Nothing. Only silence. The final sentence stood alone at the bottom of the page, written smaller than the rest, almost like a private thought, or a final warning. I do not know where they went, but I fear they were heading towards something. Samuel slowly lowered the page. The room remained silent. At last they possessed the truth they had been searching for. The triplets had escaped. Yet somehow the mystery felt larger than ever. Because if the girls survived Hollow Creek, then what exactly had become of them after they vanished into the Mississippi wilderness? And why, decades later, was the humming returning once again? The final page should have answered everything. Instead, it created even more questions. For weeks, Samuel, Abigail, and Elias searched for evidence beyond Dr. Whitmore's confession. They traced old river routes. They interviewed descendants of former plantation workers. They combed through church records, land deeds, and forgotten newspaper archives. Nothing. No names.
No graves.
No records of three sisters appearing anywhere after Blackwater River crossing. It was as though the triplets had stepped beyond history itself. And yet the humming remained. If anything, it seemed stronger now. More witnesses came forward. More stories emerged. People reported hearing the sound during storms. Hunters claimed they heard it drifting through the woods at dusk. Travelers spoke of strange vibrations beneath their feet whenever they passed near the ruins of Hollow Creek. The investigation continued, but the answers never came. Then something happened that none of them could explain. Benjamin Carter disappeared. The elderly witness who had finally broken nearly 70 years of silence vanished without warning. One morning, neighbors visited his cabin and found it empty. His bed had not been slept in. His belongings remained untouched. His cane still rested beside the front door. Nothing appeared stolen. Nothing appeared disturbed. There was no sign of struggle. No farewell note.
No footprints. No clues.
The old man was simply gone. Authorities searched the surrounding area for weeks. The nearby woods, the riverbanks, the old roads leading out of town. Nothing was found. Samuel refused to believe it was coincidence. Benjamin had been the only living witness who claimed to see the triplets crossing Blackwater River. And now he had disappeared just as suddenly as they had. The event shook everyone involved in the investigation. Abigail became increasingly convinced that they were chasing something that did not want to be understood. Elias stopped visiting Hollow Creek altogether. Even Samuel, who had spent his life collecting forgotten stories, found himself avoiding certain questions. Some mysteries seemed to resist answers. Months later, the investigation quietly came to an end. Not because the truth had been discovered, because there was nowhere left to search. The evidence stopped. The witnesses vanished. The trail simply ended. The journal was preserved inside the church archives. The cabin remained hidden deep within the forest. And the ruins of Hollow Creek continued to decay beneath vines and trees. Nature slowly reclaimed what history had abandoned. But stories have a way of surviving. Years later, people still reported strange experiences near the old plantation grounds. Children claimed to hear singing carried by the wind. Campers spoke of distant voices during thunderstorms. Some swore they saw 3 figures standing among the trees just beyond the reach of lantern light. Always 3. Always together. Always watching. Most dismissed such stories. Others did not, because the truth remained unsettlingly simple. No bodies were ever found. No graves were ever discovered. No document ever revealed what happened after the triplets crossed Blackwater River. Perhaps they escaped and lived ordinary lives somewhere far from Mississippi. Perhaps they disappeared into the wilderness and were never seen again. Or perhaps the physicians, the witnesses, and the frightened masters had only understood part of the story. Perhaps there was something waiting beyond the river. Something none of them were prepared to explain. We may never know, and maybe that is why the story endures. Not because it was solved, but because it wasn't. The Hollow Creek Triplets remain what they have always been. A mystery, a warning, a memory that refuses to disappear. And even now, when storms cross Mississippi, some claim the humming still returns from the woods where 3 sisters once vanished.